recognized as politically biased. The opportunity is great. The duty is ours. It is for us to take back control on behalf of those 17.4 million people. And a deal that didn't do that would be a betrayal of that result, a failure of government, and would have consequences for the future, leaving us as a vassal state. So unquestionably, it is easy to think of a deal that would be worse than no deal. For on no deal, we carry on trading with the rest of the world as we already do. We trade with Europe on WTO terms. We don't put up tariffs. We have a free market. We have a free economy. And we have prosperity. That is the opportunity for the nation. I therefore move the proposition.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for your speech. We now move straight to our first speaker in opposition. This is Lord Andrew Adonis, the British Labour Party politician, most famed recently for quitting the NIC amid disputes over the direction of its government policy, and is a critic of Brexit. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, can I first report serious discontent amongst the front bench speakers about the fact that the prize of the bicycles that you announced at the beginning is only available to backbench speakers? We think we should be eligible, and Jacob in particular wants to have the penny farthing if he wins. So I hope you will, because this is all about taking back control, I hope you will democratise your prizes in future. Now, unusually for this august debating society, the motion actually at stake this evening is a complete nonsense. We cannot leave the European Union without a deal of some kind. If we leave on the 29th of March next year with no deal at all, then planes will not fly, lorries will be queuing back from Dover to the M25 because of the customs checks that will be needed. There will be disruption to food supplies, and there will be shortages of basic goods. So the issue is not whether we leave with a deal or without a deal, because we have to leave with a deal. The issue is what deal we leave with. Now let me say to you very, very frankly and openly, the deal that we should construct over the next year is to stay in the European Union, which is by far the most bespoke, best set of trading, economic and political arrangements which suit us for a country. Now, can I ask you a question, because we can't put the direct motion to the House because of the motion before us. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could stay in the European Union, none of this Sweden, none of this Norway, none of this Switzerland, none of that. If we could stay, how many would be in favour of simply staying in the European Union? Would you like to show? Well, there, Mr. President, I think you there have the big issue that should be before the House, but more to the point, it should be before the country, because Jacob and I, in fact, as I discovered, I've been reading his speeches, I'm reading a lot of his effusions, and it turns out that Jacob and I actually agree on one very, very important point, that there should be a referendum on the terms of the negotiation. Jacob said in the House of Commons in 2011, when he was seeking to persuade Parliament to vote for an in-principle referendum to leave the EU, that the way of doing it that would be fair, so that the country would be able to reach a judgment on the terms, was to have a second referendum on the terms. Mr. President, I agree. I entirely agree with this proposition. He is now going to eat his words.
I'm very grateful, my lord. It was an entirely different question. Let me tell you what it was. There was a suggestion that David Cameron should have a mandate for his negotiations, and then once he'd done his negotiations, there should be an in and out vote. David Cameron did not have that first referendum. He merely had the in or out vote, which was decisive, and that is entirely consistent with the speech I gave in response to a point from a Lib Dem MP, no longer in the House, one Martin Horwood.
Well, it doesn't matter that it's in response to an extinct MP. We're all going to be extinct in due course. Indeed, Jacob was in many ways extinct many centuries ago. The issue isn't whether... The issue is not whether the person asking the question was extinct. The issue is whether the answer was relevant then and relevant now. Ladies and gentlemen, it was relevant then because that was the basis on which Jacob was seeking to persuade Parliament to agree to a referendum, was that people would have a say on those terms. It is relevant now, and the right thing for the interests of this country is that now that the British people, when the Prime Minister comes back with her withdrawal agreement at the end of the year, and we will know whether there is the 350 million on the side of the bus, whether Jacob and Nigel Farage, who work as hunt as a pack on these issues, have managed to get us out of the customs union, out of the single market, out of all those things which, remember, we were promised 2 years ago we could still be a member of. When we see those terms, the right thing for the country, the democratic thing for the country, is to do the thing that Jacob and I agree on, to have a referendum and to end this nonsense completely, stay in the European Union, and get back to dealing with the big issues that matter to members of this House this evening, and in particular to the country, the future of our NHS, the future of our education system, jobs, working conditions, and not wrecking the terms of trade that affect the future of this country. Now, I don't know which of these interventions I'm supposed to take. Mr. President, can you guide me?
You can choose.
Can you tell me which one is likely to be most favourable from the... which...
I'm going to have to just go with that one.
I'll go with the one. Okay.
Luke Usel. If the last referendum wasn't valid, what validity would another referendum be? What would make that more valid than the last one, which the British people were told was valid?
Mr. President, the last referendum was absolutely valid, but the issue put to the British people was, do you in principle support staying or leaving? You could not know the terms then because there were no terms. It was like buying the house. Remember the side of the bus, you were told that this was the perfect house. There'd never been a more beautiful house created. It had just been completely rebuilt. You had this fantastic garden. The land of milk and honey was going to flow. We were going to be able to trade with everybody in the world, even though we were going to be waving two fingers at the French, Germans, and the Irish, who happened to be our most trading partner. Remember, we were going to have trading agreements with Antarctica, with New Zealand, with all these places where apparently there's great trade to be had that we don't have it at the moment. What is now happening is a dose of... Can I please complete my point? What's now happening is a dose of reality. We now know what is going... At least we will do at the end of the year when we have the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. We will know that there's no 350 million on the side of the bus. We will know that this is a house where the roof is falling in, there's dry rot, and you've got the neighbours from hell. Or at least we certainly will have the neighbours from hell after we've spent the next few years seeking to alienate them systematically. At that point, the right thing to do is for the country to reach a judgment on the issue which matters to the country, which is, do we leave on these terms, or do we end this nonsense and stay? And the proposition I put to you this evening is that the British people should make that judgment. It cannot be made by Parliament, in my view, because of the referendum held 2 years ago. The sovereign British people should make that judgment on the basis of the actual facts that are put to them when we see the withdrawal agreements at the end of the year.
And even if it is an appalling deal, the British people vote for it in the in-out referendum you want, will you accept the result of that and accept the fact that the UK would leave? Or what would your response be in that scenario?
We are a democracy. Of course we accept the results of referendums. We accepted the result. we accepted the last result, which is why Theresa May is currently negotiating the withdrawal agreement. The issue which faces Parliament and the people is, what judgment do we reach on the terms of our withdrawal when they're presented at the end of the year? Now, Mr. President, Jacob and I are now becoming accustomed to engaging in debates of this kind. And we have the jokes well sorted out. When I was asked in our last confrontation what we should send to the French in response to the very generous loan by the President of France of the Bayeux Tapestry, I suggested we send Jacob as the... I have since had a communication from the Élysée Palace, which I share to you in great confidence because it's just arrived, that Jacob will not be acceptable in exchange because the Bayer tapestry is altogether more recent than Mr. Rees-Mogg. But underlying the jokes and the way that we conduct debates in this House, and to some extent in Parliament too, where there's a good deal of goodwill, there are very, very serious issues underlying it. And the big issue which Jacob raised in his speech, which I want to address head on, because it's fundamentally important, I'll come to it after taking this intervention, please.
Thanks to a vote of a certain number of MPs, Parliament will now get a meaningful vote on the referendum. And this will happen with a Parliament that was constituted as a result of a general election after we knew we were going to leave the EU. So why should we not leave the MPs who have asked for a meaningful vote to decide, as they're the ones in whom the public has put their democratic faith by voting for them?
It will be a matter for Parliament itself to decide what to do. And one of the options which Parliament can and should consider is whether Parliament will in fact refer this decision to the people as it referred the initial decision. Now, I myself am not a huge fan of referendums. I think this hasn't been the greatest national experience we've had in the last few years, but the people having taken the initial decision, my view is the only democratic way through this is that the people should take the final decision. But let me come to this crucial issue of trade, which is the one that we've been discussing so far. We have free trade within the largest single trading bloc that we will ever seek to trade with as a country, because as everyone knows, trade halves as distance doubles. All of our neighbours are members of the European Union. 45% of our trade is with the European Union, but another 20% of our trade, 20%, goes to the other 75 countries with which we trade by virtue of preferential trade agreements with the European, which are negotiated by the European Union. So Jacob, when he is setting out with Air Miles Fox and his team to start negotiating all these trade treaties, before we get to the issue of the United States and the issue of China, and all I can say is good luck, Little Britain, striking good trade deals with President Trump and President Xi, before we even get there, to stand still, we have to have free trade agreements with the 27 other members of the European Union and preferential trade agreements with the other 75 countries with which the EU currently has trade arrangements. Now, that, to my mind, is just an overwhelming argument against going down this road. What we are doing, for reasons which were to do with a very, very great concern in large parts of the country about being left behind, who are being told by Jacob and by Boris Johnson and by others that there was this land of milk and honey where the 350 million come back every month and it goes every week and goes to the NHS and all of that. We were told that it was possible to channel these resources into dealing with the issues that really matter in those parts of the country, which is a poor standard of living, an acute sense of being left behind, and a desperate desire to see better public services, better employment opportunities, and a better education system. My view, Mr. President, is that what we should do is put an end to this nonsense that we're engaged in at the moment, present to the British people the facts next time, and in particular, the fact that you will not be able to have your cake and eat it. We've already agreed exit terms with the European Union that are going to cost £39 billion, so the 350 million has gone west and concentrates on the big issues facing the country. And just two final points, if I may. Jacob doesn't generally speak about what he would like to do when we've left the European Union. Nigel Lawson, who was the intellectual brains behind Thatcherism and, in many ways, behind Brexit, in a very candid interview that he gave about 6 months ago, said the fundamental purpose of Brexit is to complete the Thatcher revolution. What this is fundamentally about, and the reason why it's being driven, no, I'm concluding my remarks, if I may. What this is fundamentally about is a project by the far right in politics, even though the far right sometimes speaks with a silken tongue, the far right in politics, to dismantle the social state, to dismantle environmental protection and regulations of that kind, and to start it in Brussels, and then to complete it after we've left the European Union in Westminster. And it's what Jacob himself said when, in a very candid and unguarded moment he said that what we could do is to adopt India as our model for regulation after Brexit. And he said and told the Treasury Select Committee and my esteemed colleague now chairs, we could say, he said, if it's good enough for India, it's good enough for here. There is nothing to stop that. Mr. President, there is indeed nothing to stop that if we leave the European Union, and we should put an end to this completely balmy project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We'll now take a pause from the main debate quickly to visit the student audience today, who I'd love to hear from. If you'd like to make a speech in proposition of this motion, would you please raise your hand? Yes, at the top. Can we get a microphone there, please, to the end? Thank you. Please say your name and your college for the bike.
My name's Tohin, St. Catherine's College. What the noble lord seemed to have omitted from his speech is that, in effect, we have already had two referendums. We had the referendum in 2016, and we had the general election in 2017, June, in which both major political parties promised in their manifestos to leave both the single market and the customs union. So if, and 84% of the electorate voted for either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. So if we've already had these two choices given to the public, and the public did, by and large, reject the Liberal Democrats, who kind of promised the second referendum, why on earth should we have a third referendum? And how many referenda do we need to have before we kind of come to a conclusion?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Would anyone like to make a speech in opposition of the motion? Yes, just on the chair there, next to the microphone.
Cecily Kings. So I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, because I don't think Brexit and the status of the deal is simply some kind of just a simple legal question anymore. It's a symbol of a wider political and societal struggle going on in Britain at the moment. I mean, obviously people voted for Brexit for a number of different reasons, some of which are legitimate, a backlash against our falling living standards and such that's already been outlined. But the people who are practically pushing for a no-deal option, or they're trying to get a deal from the EU that's obviously so far outside of the realms of what they accept, they're essentially pushing for a no-deal option. These are fringe political extremists that don't represent the vast majority of Brexit voters. Instead, these are people with radically backwards political views of what they want our society to look like. So take people who claim to want small government, unless you're, a gay couple who would quite like equal rights under the law, or, a woman with a body that you'd quite like to control. This is simply a... Cutting ourselves off from Europe and trying to retreat back into some imagined past is simply another facet of this. So, these are the kind of bigots that, as our first opposition speaker has pointed out, belong back in the 19th century. Joke slightly overused, I know. So not only is rejecting a deal with the EU incredibly economically harmful, as we've already seen, it's capitulating to this band of small radical political extremists who want to turn back the clock to some kind of imaginary period where everything was fine, we controlled our own borders, and they want to make Britain great again. Well, I'm sorry to say this, but bigotry and denying people rights, the kind of social agenda that these people are pushing for, is never great. And we should be saying clearly that we are turning our back on these kind of values instead of turning our back on our own neighbours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, would anybody like to speak in abstention of the motion? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Theo from Jesus. I'm not going to argue about whether the Brexit referendum was good or bad, or how the House should reach its consensus on the debate this evening. What I'd like to raise instead, given that we have some of our distinguished politicians here tonight, is regardless of your position on the question, how are you going to reach some kind of consensus between yourselves? Because I am of the opinion, and I would suggest, Mr. President, that the House may share this, that we feel like our politicians are letting us down at the moment. And I'd like to be a politician one day, Mr. Speaker, I really would. But if there are any, but if the actions of our politicians at the moment is anything to go by, then I think that I might change my mind. So in the course of this debate, I'd like to hear, whilst I definitely want to hear the views of the speakers on either side about where they stand on this motion, let's also have some consensus, because ultimately it's the future of the country that's at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to be a politician, you're in the wrong place. Let's return now to the main debate, and our second speaker for the proposition is John Mills. John is a British businessman and economist, known for founding UK-based consumer products company JML, where he's currently the chairman. In 2016, he founded Labour Leave and was previously the chair of Vote Leave. John, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much for inviting me along this evening. I must say the proceedings so far remind me a little bit of a story about Sir John Major, who went to see Michael Gorbachev at the time when perestroika was taking place. And they had a discussion, and Sir John Major said to Mr. Gorbachev, "Tell me, how is the Soviet economy doing?" And Gorbachev said, "Good." So then Sir John Major said, "Well, could you just expand a little bit on that and tell me a little more?" And Gorbachev said, "Yes, not good." And I think that's a little bit where we are with all this. But let me talk about, first of all, what I think motivated people who voted Leave, like I did, into the referendum in 2016. I think we had a fairly clear vision about what we really wanted to have. We wanted to be outside the single market. We wanted to be outside the European Economic Area, outside the customs union, and we were prepared to trade on WTO terms, although we thought it would be much better if we could negotiate a free trade deal and that there was a reasonable prospect of doing that. And if that had been accomplished, that would have met most of the objectives of the Leave campaign. We would have stopped over a period of time paying large sums of money to the European Union every year. We would have got rid of the European Court of Justice's capacity for running our affairs. We would have taken border control back. We would have been able to do something about the common agricultural policy, which has never been widely supported in the UK, still less the common fisheries policy. And we thought, be able to continue with the cooperation that had been built up over the years with the European Union and all the many areas where obviously it makes sense. Yes?
Could we get a microphone around there? That might be a bit of a challenge. Thank you.
Wait for a microphone.
There is one. It's just too many people have come. This is the problem.
I hope this isn't coming off my time.
I mean, with all due respect, isn't that just your personal speculation about what the people wanted? I mean, without a detailed referendum, how can we actually know what the people wanted, other than just a smattering of polls?
Well, for my sins, I attended a large numbers of meetings and had a fairly good opportunity to find out what people did want. Very interestingly, if you went to any meeting inside the M25 or to University Town, you could guarantee there'd be 80% Remainers and about 20% Leavers. As soon as you got outside that area, it was all completely different. So I did have a reasonable opportunity to find out what people wanted. And I think that if we'd gone ahead and been successfully achieved, would have been a reasonably satisfactory outcome for Remainers as well as for the people who wanted to leave. Now, this never happened. And the reason it never happened is for two main causes. The first is that when we started the negotiations, before the last general election, we got ourselves into a situation where we were discussing not trade, which is what the primary thing that everybody really wanted to get their heads around. We started talking about citizenship. We started talking about the cost of the divorce settlement for leaving the European Union and Ireland. And as soon as we got caught on that, we started getting into an area where we were making one concession after another. And then the second problem happened when there was the general election, which the Conservatives failed to win. And as a result of this, we finished up with a House of Commons, which was never going to vote, at least certainly not in the present circumstances, for a WTO option. And the problem then is once you've got no fallback position to fall back on, your negotiating position gets weaker and weaker. And that is the problem that we now have. Now, I would regard the option which the clean break option has been the one which you would regard as being the subject of the proposition we're discussing here this evening, and the soft option that we're heading for as being the worst terms that are likely to be available. And I think they are pretty bad. Let me tell you what I think is likely to happen. If we stay inside the single market and inside the customs union, we're never going to be able to do any deals with other countries to enable us to expand our trade overseas. We're going to finish up with a control still in place of the European Court of Justice, not just on trade terms, but on masses of companies in this country who don't even trade with the EU at all. We're going to finish up paying a large amount of money to the European Union year after year. We're going to finish up with the situation on trade exactly as it is at the moment. This is a very, very poor outcome indeed, and one which surely, for a country which is the 5th or 6th largest in the world, for us to be in a situation where we're substantially under control of another body, the European Union, unable to make our own laws. Yeah? Okay, somebody wants to interject?
Hello. Matthew Isaacs. A lot of the discussion so far has been on control, but presumably in your position, if there is no deal, that means there is no deal on what the situation in Northern Ireland will be. That means there'll be no arrangement for how we will deal with a land border with different regulations in the UK and the European Union, which leaves an easy way for people to import into the UK and then get into the European Union. How do you propose, in a situation where there is no deal, to deal with that issue?
Well, I think in the big scheme of things, the Irish border is not a problem which is insoluble by any stretch of the imagination. It is going to require a certain amount, it will require a certain amount of goodwill, but there are certainly mechanisms for overcoming that problem. There's two elements to it, really. One is people and the other is goods. The situation on people is that people can move around inside the European Union with the new any new dispensation we've got, by flying in there as a tourist or whatever it is. You don't need to have any sort of border control to stop people moving across the border. On goods, what you do need is some mechanism for making sure that you deal, if you're going to have a border at all, with certificates of origin and these sort of problems. I mean, there is already a separate VAT regime in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. You've got to build slightly on that. You've got to have a trusted trader system. You've got to have an AEO arrangement. You've got to have pre-clearance. You've got to get the whole thing automated, just as it is, for example, between Canada and the United States, where there's a pretty transparent border in place, which I'm sure would be achievable there, and indeed with the rest of the European Union as well. Finally, just going to say, well, how is this all going to pan out in the end? I must say, I think the deal we're likely to be offered by the European Union is so poor that when it comes to Parliament in October this year, there's a reasonable chance it'll get voted down. And the question then is what's going to happen next. I don't think you could have a referendum which says, are you going to accept the terms that have been offered by the European Union or not, unless you know exactly what the alternative might be. And I suspect we may be drifting towards eventually having some sort of referendum where the decision is going to be, do we rejoin the European Union if we've already left, or do we abandon the whole process of leaving that we're talking about? Or on the other hand, do we accept the relatively hard Brexit, which I referred to at the very beginning? And I think you would be very rash to assume that the outcome of another referendum would be that you want to stay in the European Union. I suspect that all the underlying reasons why people wanted to leave are still there, and that the terms of which we go back to the European Union may well involve not being able to continue with the rebate, potentially an obligation to join the euro, and then you're still stuck with the problem of whether you really want to be in a European Union which is becoming a unitary state, which I don't think anybody in Britain does, or whether you finish up on the other side, on the periphery of a state which is becoming stronger and stronger, but which we're not part of. So if I can just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by just telling you a small story, which is not really particularly relevant to the EU, but I think has got some bearing on where we are at the moment in these negotiations, and it goes like this. It's a transcript of an actual radio conversation between a US naval ship and the Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October 1995. Americans, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Canadians, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south. Americans, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadians, no, you divert your course. Americans, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship of the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that is 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse. Your call.
Very good. Well done.
This story is completely false. So, what do you have to say about that?
Didn't get that.
Thank you. We'll continue now to the second speaker on the opposition. This is Nicky Morgan. Nicky is the former Secretary of State for Education, former Minister for Women and Equalities. She's a Conservative MP who was most recently elected Chair of the Treasury Select Committee following the 2017 general election. Nicky, thanks for coming.
Well, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's very nice to be back near a dispatch box. I suspect this may be the closest I'm going to get for some years and months to come. So thank you for this opportunity to be here and to speak to you tonight on this exciting topic of Brexit. Not something that Jacob and I are bored of talking about at all. And it goes on and on and on. One of my favourite Mrs. Thatcher quotes: if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. So, Mr. President, I'm going to do something unique so far, certainly amongst speakers from the other side of the House. I'm going to talk about the motion. I'm going to talk... Please, go ahead.
The noble Lord Adonis, who in fact ignored the motion entirely and proposed that we have a no deal of sorts, which is actually rescinding Article 50. It's your side of the House that isn't talking about the motion.
Well, why don't you listen to what I have to say, and then you can see whether or not you agree with it when you get to vote this evening. Because, Mr. President, we need to be clear what is meant by no deal. It doesn't mean keeping to the status quo. It doesn't mean unwinding or ignoring the results of the referendum in June 2016. And it grieves me as somebody who campaigned for Remain that we are where we are. But the fact is we live in a democracy. A vote took place, 17.4 million people voted one way, and 16-point-something million voted a different way. Now, even before I became chair of the Treasury Select Committee, the most important rule in politics is count the numbers. The Leave side won. So to listen to Jacob and to others being very clever in talking about this tonight, because actually they've been talking about the referendum campaign, about why we should leave the European Union. And I disagree on that, but we have perfectly entitled to disagree. But this is not about rerunning the referendum. It's not about second-guessing what we think the European Union is going to offer us. It's about thinking about what we want as a country, and I take the honourable gentleman's challenge over there for modern-day politicians to step up to the plate. Because the honest truth of the matter is, I don't think we're doing a very good job of discussing this at the moment. Nearly 2 years after the referendum, we should be much, much clearer as a country about what we want from Brexit, what the end state is going to look like. And I think if we were, we would build, let me just finish this, if we had that clearer vision, I suspect that Jacob and I, who I've known for 25 years, I think he was wearing the same shoes at the Oxford Union all those years ago, we probably could arrive at a consensus. Yes, of course.
Just in response to actually what we want as a country from this referendum, I'd like to quote the great Lord Tebbit, who described the Brexit vote as goodbye and thank you very much. It was mentioned by the opposition, the idea of being realistic, actually appealing to the real world. And when I look at the real world, when I look outside of those suburbs of London, I see Britain as a country as the 5th largest economy in the world. I see a nation that won 2 world wars and has a commonwealth that desires to trade with us, that loves our culture, our language, and our legal system. And yet what I see from the opposition is a view of pessimism, a view that attempts to tell us that we are nothing, we are worthless.
Are you going to give way now, or are you going to carry on with the speech? Go on.
Continue. My point is made.
Because I agree in the sense that, yes, we should be thinking about what our country wants, what our country is, and our country standing in the world. And a chaotic, disorderly, no-deal Brexit will destabilise this country. It will destabilise our democracy, and it will destabilise and undermine Britain's standing in the world. A no-deal Brexit, chaotic and disorderly, will mean a hard border in Northern Ireland. And nobody who can remember what Northern Ireland was like in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s could possibly want to go back to that. It will mean chaos for our small businesses. And let me tell you, as a Member of Parliament who represents somewhere outside the suburbs of London, yes, there are more places. Loughborough relies, the Midlands relies on small manufacturing businesses, businesses passed down from generation to generation, businesses born at Loughborough University, businesses that people put everything they have into it. And actually to find that the government has struck a deal or has failed to strike a deal that does them damage would be completely unfair on those businesses and the people that they employ. A no deal would say that we are a country that turns our back on our international obligations. 4 million EU citizens in this country would be completely uncertain about their position. It would mean disruption at our ports, at our airports. And mostly, for those who think these are important, it would mean that the UK was in a weak position to negotiate new free trade agreements. It would also mean an inability for our government to get on with wider policy making. And one of my biggest objections to Brexit is that there were many reasons why people voted to leave. There were many reasons that need to be tackled, many issues. Social care, continuing rise in educational standards, globalization, businesses, automation, all the things that need to be tackled. And yet it's fair to say that the oxygen is being sucked out of Westminster and Whitehall at the moment because of Brexit. Imagine if we had a chaotic, disorderly, no-deal Brexit, the government would be faced with dealing with that. All the other things that you think and I think are important would not get a look in. That's not fair on this country. Now ask yourselves, and I think the speaker over there began to do this very well, who wants a no deal? Not the Prime Minister, because she's been very clear she wants there to be a deal. Not our allies around the world, including the States, because they want us to have a deal with the European Union. Not the majority in Parliament, as somebody was talking about earlier on. Not our universities, who rely on ideas and people to come from the EU and people to go over there. And not our businesses. So as the speaker there said, who does want a no deal? Those who wish this country ill, who want to destabilize it. Those who want us to be a minimal tax, minimal regulation country, including some of our newspaper proprietors. And those who are political ideologues, who are so caught up in the majesty of Brexit that they have forgotten who loses out, including the little old lady on her mobility scooter when our economy can't sustain looking after the elderly properly. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen the economic analysis that has been revealed to Parliament this week. I could go on about numbers, about impacts on regions of the country, impacts on different sectors. And I might just say, in answer to one point that Jacob made, it's not that the OBR figures have been completely disproved. It's that somebody else has come up with a different set of forecasts. That's what happens. But you don't win arguments by undermining the people who have made a counter-argument. You win arguments by taking them on. You don't take on members of Parliament by calling them mutineers. You don't take on judges by calling them the enemies of the people. You have the confidence of your arguments and you take them on. But Brexit is about more than numbers. It is exactly about the kind of country that we want. It's about the kind of country that we want others around the world to know that we are. We are a country that works with others, that sticks to our international commitments and looks after our people, not expose them to something which will hurt them. Mr. President, your motion is easy to answer tonight. No deal is a bad deal. It is counter to the national interest. It is bad for your futures. It is bad for our constituents, bad for this country, and bad for global Britain. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, without hesitation, to oppose this motion tonight. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you very much. We now move to our third speaker for the proposition, who is Gerard Lyons. Gerard is the student president of the Cambridge Brexit campaign and is currently in his third year studying theology at Sydney Sussex. I also thank him for helping putting this debate together. Gerard, the floor is yours. Can we have a microphone, please? Oh, Tom, you've got it. Thanks.
Mr. President, no deal is better than a bad deal. We must avoid a bad deal at all costs. President Macron has highlighted a reality that we need to face up to. Either the EU fragments into different layers with a core and a periphery, or it marches on to ever closer union. The reality is a bad deal would align us to an EU whose future direction is not good. It's not good. It's defined by the euro, which is inherently flawed. We do not want to be either in the periphery or as close as we can be. A bad deal would also constrain our future room for economic maneuver, both at home and globally, and thus limit growth. It would tie us to EU rules and regulations and limit our ability to cut trade deals globally. Thus, a bad deal limits our position and ability to maneuver. We must avoid the short-termism that has defined much of UK policy making in recent decades and look at the long-term vision. A bad deal does not allow this. Globalization, technological change, innovation, and the fourth industrial revolution are all things that we should be excited about, especially in the UK economy that is defined by services. A bad deal would task to Brussels and an EU that is centralizing, controlling, and regulating. The EU is a shrinking part of the global economy. The EU 28 would have been 34.1% of the world in 1980. Now they're just 22%. After we leave, they'll go below 1/5. The EU is a declining part of the exports market. In 2000, it accounted for 61%. In 2015, it was 44%. It may vary from year to year, but the trend is clear. It is down. Even the European Commission itself highlights that 85% of global growth in the future will occur outside the European Union. And the single market is widely acknowledged not to do justice to the service sector economy, which is what constitutes 4/5 of the British economy. So why tie ourselves with a bad deal? What about a no deal? A no deal is not the same as walking away. A no deal is where we can realize we cannot reach an agreement on trade. But both sides accept that for safety and other reasons, we need to have a future working relationship with the EU on areas such as landing rights and cooperation on terrorism and defense. There are challenges with leaving, as we have seen, but this is because the EU has infiltrated so much of our life. When we leave an organization that we've been a part of for so many decades, it's not surprising there are going to be issues. But the further one looks ahead, the better our prospects will be outside the EU. In my opinion, young people have so much to gain from a no deal versus a bad deal. Young people want freedom to travel and work in the EU. This is still going to be the case. No one disputes that. As for work, let's look at the facts. In 2012, a comprehensive Home Office report entitled Immigration from the UK showed if people leave the UK to retire, they go to the EU.
Point of information.
Yeah, go ahead.
Don't you need a deal for UK students to still be able to go to the EU, and you need a deal for EU students to go to the UK? If you have a no deal, then you lose Erasmus and nothing is put in its place. So you need some sort of deal to cooperate with terrorism. That's just not true. I'm sorry.
No, it's not. Actually, that's not the case, and it sort of links into Lord Adonis's point about planes falling out of the sky, which I'm later going to come on to. The reality is, as for work, let's look at two things. If people leave the UK to retire, they go to the EU. If people leave the UK to work, they usually go elsewhere. When people of all ages leave the UK to get jobs elsewhere, 5 out of the 8 economies they go to are not in the EU. This is not surprising. If you look at youth unemployment, it's incredibly high. In Greece, it's 1 in 2. In Spain, it's 1 in 4. The EU has frankly failed the youth. The youth should be interested in democracy and accountability. Westminster with a no deal will be far more democratic and accountable than Brussels with a bad deal. The UK looking globally with a no deal will be far more international than protectionist EU. The choice is this: be international, embrace the world with a no deal, versus being part of a protectionist, inward-looking bloc with a bad deal. On that point, sir. 1 second. If young people believe in openness and democracy, then be aware of a bad deal. As Juncker has said, when things get serious, you have to lie. This is what happens. We were told in the late 1990s that if we didn't join the euro, the economy would suffer. That was the case. We were told with the exchange rate mechanism that we'd suffer. That wasn't the case.
Sorry, can you wait for a microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. I was just slightly curious with some of your reasoning behind those facts you were just giving us. If it is in fact the case that most people who leave Britain to work don't do so within the European Union, and somehow part of your argument for the glory of Brexit is that afterwards we'll be able to leave, has it not crossed your mind that people don't leave Britain to work because it's such a great place to work because we are in the European Union? And that precisely your argument that we will leave, that people will be more inclined to leave to work elsewhere is because we will not be as much of an attractive workplace as we are right now.
We will be just as attractive. And the reality is we want an immigration system whereby we don't have to discriminate against people who are not in the EU. I'm quite rushed for time. Please, the speaker over there mentioned workers' rights. Equally, with a no deal, we would have control over workers' rights. With no deal, laws and regulations would be determined by Parliament, who are answerable to UK voters. And many of the existing UK rules on pay and labour conditions are already far more progressive than our EU counterparts. Let's take the example of minimum wage and maternity rights. The UK has one of the highest minimum wages in the world, while there's no minimum wage across the EU. Only 18 out of 28 nations have a minimum wage. EU law requires a minimum of 14 weeks maternity pay with no minimum pay level. Meanwhile, UK law provides 52 weeks on 90% pay for 6 weeks and £140 per week after. And more recently, the UK is now trying to address workers' rights in the gig economy, which is long overdue, but ahead of the European Union. And these points tap into what the speaker was saying earlier, that a no deal isn't in fact a race to the bottom, but in fact we can control these and lobby our MPs democratically. Now, a no deal has not just been about a Tory, it merits cross-party support. Since joining the European Economic Community in 1973, we tend to see our relationship with the EU through an economic lens. We usually opt to ignore the political underpinnings that define this project, which other EU countries see from. Leaving and a no deal is not solely about the economy. A main argument for leaving the EU was about restoring sovereignty. This was highlighted by Labour politicians as the reason not to join in the first place. Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell said in 1962 a powerful speech echoing this point at the Labour Party conference, and both Peter Shaw and Toby Benn said this ahead of the 1975 referendum. The point of this is that a no deal isn't just a Tory party dispute, but it can benefit everyone across the political spectrum. Now, no deal means trading on WTO rules, and John has touched on this item, so I won't bore you anymore. But what I would say to sort of address Lord Adonis's point is that ignore project fear that our ports and lorries will stop. John Thompson, the chief executive of HMRC, has been quizzed by parliamentary committees 7 times since the referendum. Each of these 7 times, he said there'll be no problem with our lorries and ports from day one.
No, he hasn't.
Finally,
no, he hasn't.
Finally,
no, he hasn't.
Finally, Miss Morgan made, she quotes, this is not, if a bad deal would mean that we're turning away from our international commitments. Let's be frank, with a no deal, we'd still have global influence than with a bad deal. Britain will remain a key member of the G7 and G20. The UK will be a part of the OECD group. It will play a key role in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We are second to America in the Global University League tables for universities, with 16 out of the top 100. We'd still be a member of the Financial Stability Board. We would gain our seat on WTO instead of being represented as just one state of the 28. We would play a lead role in NATO. Our military capability would be that of the whole EU27 combined. We'd still be one of the 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council. Britain would still be at the heart of the Five Eyes group that works on intelligence and defence. The point here is that we don't suddenly lose influence overnight by a no deal. The planes don't fall out of the sky. We can, and it's better than a bad deal. Finally, young people are often told that a bad deal or Brexit is very inward-looking and not progressive. But I'd say 1 in 12 people are an Indian under the age of 27. The whole world economy and the whole global environment is changing. We have to look out there as opposed to a very inward-looking protectionist bloc. And for that reason, I beg you to propose the motion.
Gerard, thank you very much. We now move to our third speaker on the opposition. Imran Mateo is a penultimate year law student at Queen's and is one of the union's 2 debating officers. He represented the union at both the World and European University Debating Championships. Imran, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The European Union is the United Kingdom's largest trading partner. In 2016, 43% of the United Kingdom's exports were to the European Union, and 54% of its imports came from the European Union. Now, I just want you to think about those percentages, because clearly there is a huge amount of trade that occurs with the European Union. In the circumstance that there was to be no deal, think about what would happen to all of that trade. Think about all the regulations that currently apply to the goods and services that are traded to the European Union. Think about how compliance would be reached. Think about how we would be able to maintain that trade and how the economy would be able to continue. Because in the absence of any deal, or in the absence of any form of agreement or formal agreement with the European Union, we need to consider how on earth the United Kingdom would be able to continue such large amounts of trade. It is undeniable that such integration has been fostered by the UK's membership of the EU and the free trade benefits that have been accrued as a result of its membership. There are two things I'd like to clarify in this debate before continuing, because I feel that these two pieces of context are extremely important before moving on. Firstly, we need to think about what exactly is a deal, and what do we mean when we talk about it, right? In short, I think it's two-pronged, and there are two parts to this, right? The first bit is figuring out what are the existing liabilities we have to the European Union, quantifying and resolving the existing things that the UK owes to the European Union as a result of its membership. But secondly, and also more importantly, it's dealing with the future relationships with the remaining 27 countries within the European Union, right? Because recognize at the point in which we can see that the EU as a bloc is the largest trading partner with the United Kingdom, it becomes entirely unclear how some of the proposition's arguments necessarily make sense, because it's not like the rest of the world is suddenly going to fill in this 43% of trade by accepting exports and giving us imports. It's far more likely that there's going to be some sort of a time lag at the very least. If not, they're not going to opt to take trade from the UK. I think it's extremely dangerous if what you're trying to say is immediately all of this trade is going to be filled in by other countries, because it's unclear why that's the case. Even more importantly, it's unclear what will happen with trade with the European Union at this point if there were no deal. Because the reason that it's very easy for trade to be conducted at the moment is because the UK operates on the same kinds of regulations as the European Union as it stands. It uses the same kind of standards in terms of agricultural vetting. It uses the same kinds of standards that are applied to pharmaceuticals. It's far easier, and you have compliance in a much easier manner because the standards are identical. At the point in which you're not able to guarantee these standards, at the point in which you're no longer able to ensure that these are the same standards you're operating on, what happens at that point? What do we do then? Henry?
Might I remind the honourable member that we do actually trade with nations with whom we do not have free trade agreements. Companies can produce products and manufacture products to other nations' regulations, and they can trade with those nations as we do. I think it's perfectly legitimate, perfectly fine, and with our regulations being so similar to the EU at the moment, trade would continue under tariffs, I'll accept, but trade would continue just as any company trading with a nation without a free trade deal.
I take your point, but clearly there is a high degree of uncertainty when you're not able to guarantee what happens into the future. Because if what you're saying is necessarily the EU has to accept UK standards, that's not the case. The reason that the EU currently accepts UK standards is because it's in exact compliance with what the EU standards are. There's no necessity for them to continue on such basis, and you can't be certain that there won't be detrimental effect as a result of that. The second thing that is important to characterize in this debate is what is no deal and what is a bad deal. And the opposition side has done a very good job in terms of talking about this so far. And I think we need to realize that a bad deal, or the term, doesn't enlighten us at all. Because what is a bad deal, and how do you characterize it as a bad deal? Obviously, it is a bad deal when you set the yardsticks yourself and you say that if it doesn't fulfill these yardsticks, that's something that's bad. And we heard a few examples of this coming from the proposition, right? So when they told us things like you would no longer be able to control the law, when you wouldn't be able to control borders, they told us that these were the metrics that they were going by to determine what was good and what was bad. Now, I'm going to point out a couple of things on why I don't think these arguments necessarily are true. Firstly, so the third proposition speaker, Gerard, came up and told us that the UK has far better worker regulations and that it provides a much greater degree of protection, which is far more exacting than the European Union. So in these circumstances, I don't really see what changes, because you're telling us that the UK is giving us better protection already. Therefore, the EU isn't really imposing anything, because the highest standards in these circumstances are imposed by UK law. But secondly, we heard things around the fact that, we don't want in the interim period to keep on using EU law in these circumstances. Now, the first thing that I'd point out is there have been proposals very recently that on exit day what will happen is there will be a snapshot of EU law as it exists, and that will be imported into UK law. So number one, I think that probably already is going to become the plan, because it's unclear how you would otherwise legislate in such a vast variety of circumstances for so many different issues without a clear idea of what you are going for. So probably even if we were to achieve a deal, there would be some sort of a snapshot of EU law taken in at that point in time. Maybe we will no longer be following the interpretations of the European Court of Justice at that point, and maybe it'll be something that's just interpreted by UK courts. The very fact of the matter is, at some level, you are going to need to maintain EU jurisprudence and EU regulations, but just by simple virtue of the fact that you cannot, in such a short period of time, enact legislation to meet all of the things that have occurred over the past few decades in all the very multifaceted areas that EU law turns to regulate. Now, Angus.
They don't want to leave on no deal. But in order to say that no deal is better than a bad deal, I think you need to justify us that no deal is worse than any other conceivable deal we should have. So don't compare it to some good deals. Try and come up with some really bad deals and explain why you think no deal is even worse than that.
Yep, I take your point, Angus, on that. Now, I think in fairness, the first speaker of the proposition said that we can't take the worst possible deal, and we'll take some sort of a reasonable middle ground as to what a bad deal is to make it a sensible debate about what happens. Now, I think the very easy way to go around this is by looking at what actually happens when you have no deal, looking at the uncertainty that it creates, looking at the inability of planes to fly, looking at the traffic jams that you'll cause at the borders, looking at all of the compliance problems that you create, and think of that uncertainty. Think of all the lives of the individuals that will be affected as a result of the uncertainty. Think of the 4 million people living in the UK who will be entirely uncertain of what the plans for their future are. Yes, they may be physically living in the UK as a matter of fact, but think about all of the issues that will be troubling them. Think about what they need to know. Surely they have a right to a deal that will ensure that at the very least they have some sort of certainty as to their future, and that there is some thought into what goes into that. So no deal necessarily would mean that a huge number of individuals are faced with a vast amount of uncertainty, entirely unclear about what will happen to them, surely in any circumstance that is far, far worse for everyone. Now, a final thing that I'm going to talk about is basically on the inability to form trade with other countries as a result of a membership of the common market or prescribing to certain EU legislation. Now, look, I think the first thing that proposition needs to prove in order to make this claim necessarily is that trade with countries outside the EU is going to be beneficial in all circumstances, right? I think our side has given you very clear reasons as to why trade with the EU oftentimes is better, and oftentimes when you increase the distance between a country, oftentimes it just looks like trade is far less palatable, mainly because you're firstly going to be paying transport costs for a very large variety of things, but secondly also because it's far easier for you to be sending these products to these areas. Now, I don't think side proposition has given us any reason as to why there is such a demand from other countries, from other areas in the world to trade with the UK necessarily, and why, I'll take you in a minute, and why that's definitely going to be a consequence of the UK leaving the EU. But secondly, there's also no analysis as to why, in terms of why we will be able to fill that trade within a reasonable duration that will mean it makes sense necessarily for us to have that trade. Yep.
Hello. The opposition seems to be focusing on the value of the trade with the EU, and that far surpasses that of any potential trade deals with countries outside the EU. Has the opposition ever considered that perhaps diversification of trade deals with a wide variety of countries could perhaps improve the economic security of the UK instead of being wholly reliant on just one single partner, which perhaps might not give us the best of deals?
Yeah, but a diversification... A diversification of the countries that you trade with doesn't necessarily promote economic stability, right? Because it also is in terms of the things you're trading, what you're giving and what you're getting back in return. It's not just a function of the countries that you're trading with, it's also a function of the products that you're trading with these countries. And in some circumstances, it makes a lot more sense to trade with the EU. Members of the audience, at the end of this debate, the President will invite you to vote on your feet, be that in proposition of the motion, be that an abstention of the motion, or be that in opposition of the motion. If there is one thing that you think of when you're making that vote, think of the uncertainty that no deal will create. Think about the harm that that will tangibly cause to millions of people and to people who deserve to know their futures, who deserve to know what will happen as the result of Brexit. Make no mistake, no deal is the bad deal. Mr. President, oppose.
Would anyone like to make a speech in proposition of the motion? Go on then.
Angus Groom, Trinity College. It's a sign of the dire state of British politics that whenever anyone asks a question, we line up with Leavers and Remainers and have a debate about whether or not we should stay in the EU, regardless of what the question was that was actually asked. Some speakers have made attempts to actually get at this question: is no deal better than a bad deal? It's not about whether we can come up with any deals that might be better than no deal. As some over here might argue, leaving the EU, leaving the customs union, and getting tariff-free access to the EU. As some over here might argue, leaving the EU and staying in the single market, or maybe not leaving the EU altogether. The question before the House is whether no deal is better than a bad deal. And so what we need to do to answer yes to that question is come up with a deal worse than no deal. And I think the honourable gentleman who started this debate set himself too high a bar, particularly too high a bar for this audience, and I think he acknowledged that when saying, yes, we could just say, can we think of some really bad deals, but can we try and say that leaving the single market is better, and having no deal is better than staying in the single market. But really, we can come up with as bad a deal as we want, and if no deal is better than it, then we should vote for this motion. And we've heard about all the negative effects of no deal. We've heard about all the uncertainty and the tangible harms this would create. So if you want a deal worse than no deal, take no deal and start adding stuff on. No deal, the contents of a no deal deal, and we still pay in billions of pounds to the EU budget. Okay, we might still like that. No deal, and we inflate Nigel Farage's pension by £1 million. No deal, and we go to war with Spain over Gibraltar. Members, the question before the House is whether we can come up with any deals worse than a bad deal. I've thoroughly enjoyed the debate this evening, and I'm sure that I will enjoy many more debates on whether or not we should stay in the EU in the future. And we can all vote with our hearts on whether or not we think we should be in the EU, out the EU, in the single market, out the single market. But tonight we will vote with our feet and we will vote on this motion. So I urge you all, come up with the next 20 minutes thinking of some really bad deals. And I'm sure that between us we can come up with some worse than no deal. Don't go to war with Gibraltar. Don't inflate Nigel Farage's pension. Vote for the proposition.
Thank you. Would anyone like to make a speech in opposition of the motion? At the very back against the window on the right. Yes. Thank you.
We could spend the next 20 minutes thinking of the worst deal possible, but we won't, because that would be a waste of all of our time. We're actually here to talk about things which might plausibly have an effect on the way we're governed in the future, might plausibly affect our economy in the future, and creating ridiculous worst-case scenarios which will never actually happen is not a useful way to do that. But I do take Angus's point, which is basically that no one's told us what a bad deal looks like. And I think that's probably a deliberate strategy on the part of the proposition. The reason they haven't told us what a bad deal would look like or what they think a bad deal might be is that that's incredibly convenient for them, because it allows them to brush off all of the concerns raised by the opposition bench and just say, oh, but a bad deal is necessarily worse than that because the word bad means bad things. Ladies and gentlemen, the word bad is not an argument. It's not a description of what the world would look like. It's just a word. Don't let them get away with saying we must be right because the word bad means bad. Make them, in their next speeches, tell us what their worst case scenario is. Is their worst case scenario like obeying the verdict of the ECJ for a few more years? Like, that doesn't sound too bad. Is their worst case scenario like slightly misunderstanding what the British people voted for when they left the EU? Because frankly, the British people didn't vote for their economy to crash either. So we're not going to be able to satisfy all of the demands of the British people on either side of the house. Like, I simply don't understand what proposition is scared off in this debate. It would be really nice if one of them could tell us.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, a speech in abstention. Yes, at the top as well. Lots of balcony speakers this evening.
Thank you very much.
Can you say your name and college? Sorry.
Kirill Reshtov, Fitzwilliam College. So I think in many ways, the reason I urge you to abstain is because the damage is already done. And I'm going to talk about two things which aren't talked about enough in relation to Brexit. And the first is the fall in the pound. Now, that's been up to 15% in respect to the euro, but I'd actually think that when you're looking at the fall in the pound, you need to look beyond the referendum itself, but to the start of the uncertainty which the referendum caused. So perhaps to December 2016, something like that. Now, I'd like you all to cast your minds back to the general election last year. What were the main issues that were being debated? Cost of living, in-work poverty, things like this. And Jacob Rees-Mogg talks very eloquently about the 21% that's spent on essentials, food, clothing, babies' clothes, things like this. Well, and I think that the reason it was such an issue last election in particular was that people are paying 20% more every week for their shopping. Of course, if you're a nurse on £20,000 a year, that's going to drive you into in-work poverty. And it is the poisonous combination of austerity and the Brexit, which is peddled by people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, that is driving these horrible conditions across our country. And the second thing is about the fall, the fleeing of financial services. Now, Jacob, once again, Rees-Mogg mentioned once again how fortunate we are that the people at the very top pay the most tax. So in 2014, for example, the top 3,000 earners in this country paid more tax than the bottom 9 million. Now, that's I'm not going to say whether this is good or bad, but the point is we are reliant on these revenues. And as the forecasts have seen, and as we've seen, JP Morgan buying a big office in Dublin, Bank of America.
Carol, could you bring your speech to a close?
Oh, okay,
Sorry.
sure.
Thank you.
Depending on which think tank you trust, we're going to lose between 10,000 to 75,000 jobs in the financial services, and that's a big blow to the revenues of the Exchequer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Returning to the main debate, our final speaker in proposition, Dame Helena Morrissey, the former CEO of Newton Investment Management and currently the head of personal investing at Legal & General. Helena was recently awarded an honorary doctorate by Cambridge University. Helena, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I was slightly nervous about going last or penultimate speaker of the night, but it appears on Brexit there is always something left to say. Now, my philosophy degree taken here at this great university some 30 years ago taught me that no one has all the answers, particularly to the difficult questions, and that to reach the right conclusion, we do need to be open-minded, to listen, to be measured, calm, and most of all, to be logical. My experience since as a businesswoman, as a campaigner for gender equality, and as a mother of 9, yes, even more children than you, Jacob, it's quite a lot, impressive tally between us, has also taught me the importance of a vision and self-belief, to not be discouraged by the naysayers who have told me, often repeatedly, that it was impossible to do, well, pretty much anything that I now feel proud of. One thing I am sure about, if we think we can't achieve something, then we most certainly won't be able to. Now, sadly, one of the problems, the big problems that we face in this country in trying to develop that future vision, is that so many people, including Lord Adonis, and I believe, judging from previous speeches of yours, Lord Villamoria, do not want to accept the result of the referendum and seem determined to sabotage it, taking a pessimistic position that almost inevitably undermines our prospects. So tonight, I will, in wrapping up for our side, the proposition, remind us all again that we are not debating whether Britain should remain or leave the EU. Whatever your views, sorry, yes, of course.
Andrew Catherall, Homerton College. No one like Lord Adonis, who's arguing for a referendum on the final deal, is arguing for a second referendum. We've had the referendum. We've started the process of leaving the European Union. What we're saying, and this new student campaign, Our Future, Our Choice, is saying, is that the British people should have the final say of whether we accept the deal or we reject the deal.
I think you'll find that Lord Adonis said that it was all nonsense, that we should never leave. So more people in this country, so whatever your own views, more people in this country voted to leave the European Union than have ever voted for any government in the United Kingdom. What we are talking about tonight is the best way to leave if we can't secure a good deal. Now, the gentleman up there said that no one had defined what a bad deal is, and I think it's partly because, by definition, it's a deal that is not in the interests of this country. For me, it's the worst of all worlds. It is being tied to the EU, to have to abide by all the restrictions of the EU, and not to have the freedoms that we might have hoped to achieve by voting to leave. Okay?
Pastor Girton College. May I just point out the hypocrisy on the side of the opposition, of the proposition, in saying that we should take back control and that our parliament is once again sovereign. May I just point out that the Clause 7, Clause 9, and Clause 17 of the EU Withdrawal Bill has been subject to scathing criticism by the House of Lords Constitution Committee. So the option of no deal and taking back control is not a real one, is not a realistic one. Is she aware that basically leaving the European Union means handing the government a legislative blank check, rewriting the statute book in whatever way a few ministers deem fit? Does she really believe that a bad deal is about restoring parliamentary sovereignty or supporting an authoritarian government rewriting our statute book?
So I will address, as I go on, what I think the deal that we want to get looks like. And I do believe that sometimes we take this assumption that people sitting in the House of Lords or the House of Commons have a view that we must all then think is a static view. I think that we are moving gradually through this process, but I will come back, if I may, sir, towards the end and summarize about what I think we're looking for. But logically, and my new friend Angus over there made the excellent points, if you do not support tonight's motion, you must inevitably believe that no deal is very bad indeed. Now, before we look at the actual evidence, let's look at the guesswork, those no-deal economic projections put together from the civil service. Now, I do not believe that officials fiddled the numbers as been suggested, but neither do I believe that they were given a clear vision, a framework for the analysis, which anyone who works in fund management and investment knows is absolutely essential. It was the status quo they were given minus the current EU trading relationship. It's a very one-dimensional analysis. A lot of the commentary here tonight assumes that everything stays the same. We just take away one piece of the puzzle. But of course, taking away just one piece means inevitably the result will be negative. That is not the right way to look at it. The officials were not given the right exam question, as it were. The future will not be the past or an extrapolation of the past, minus a little bit. Instead, we need to take a multi-dimensional view. We look at the fact that under a no-deal scenario, where we have just said no to bad terms, no to constraints, we would also gain new degrees of freedom. The right question that the officials should have been asked is how can we self-determine our success post-Brexit? Or more snappily, given the challenge, let's grow. Then and only then can they or we come up with a vision, a framework to build a more logical, realistic forecast that builds on our many areas of competitive advantage, along, of course, with a list of those issues that we need to address in this country if we are ever inside or outside the EU to really fire on all cylinders, including low productivity. This gentleman is asked several times. I would like to defer to this gentleman and get some water while you ask me a question.
Your refusal to give us any kind of palpable scenario beyond the notion of it being nightmarish of a bad deal or apocalyptic, I still look forward to it, is just too convenient for you in order for you not to give any scenario. Because remember that the EU has none of the incentives to foist a negative scenario like Angus describes, because the EU still wants to retain the rights of 4 million people within this country, the rights of getting British products, for example, back. Keeping goodwill from the EU only happens within the negotiations. They have it because they have interests at stake. Why leave and ensure then an apocalyptic scenario which is certain rather than way too convenient for you not to describe under a bad deal?
Okay, well, obviously, I will explain why it is not apocalypse. The list of our strengths in this country is hugely compelling. By having great things to offer, not by being part of the EU to start with, by having a global and innovative approach, Britain has earned the #1 rankings globally in the key industries, not just of today, but tomorrow. So we are #1 in fintech, in financial and professional services. We are market leaders in clean energy and green finance, world class right across the entire spectrum of the creative industries, filmmaking, drama. Just look at the upcoming Oscars. Some of the categories look sort of like the Battle of the Britons rather than a global competition. We are brilliant at music, art, fashion, architecture, education. We are home to world-leading medical and scientific research, obviously including here at Cambridge. English law is the global deal-maker's choice. English language is the international language of the world. My own sector, fund management, we are second only to the United States. We regard ourselves as competitive with them. They are our competition, not the German, French, and Italian markets. If you add them all up together, the UK market is still bigger. Ultimately, people, companies, and countries trade with each other, not because of a trade deal, but because each has something the other wants. We don't need to have trade deals to do business. And Lord Bilimoria himself put it in a recent interview. Did I need free trade deals when I encouraged business between the UK and India? We got on with it. So, no deal, what it actually means. All it means is no bespoke EU-UK deal. That is all it means. It does not mean a vacuum. It simply means falling back on a comprehensive trade framework, the WTO rules. Those rules already form the basis of over half Britain's trade, including in services, including with the US, with China, with India, where the EU still has no trade deal. In a no-deal scenario, the WTO framework will also protect us and help us with our trading with the EU. One of its fundamental rules that hasn't been mentioned before is non-discrimination. A member of the WTO, which includes the EU, is not allowed to discriminate between its trading partners or discriminate between its own and foreign products or services. Yes, sir?
I think you've just given there a very convenient definition of what no deal is for your side of the house.
It is the definition.
No, it isn't. You haven't considered all manner of EU agencies that the UK would automatically be outside of. What about Euratom? What about Open Skies? Those things need agreements. If you don't have a deal, by very definition, you're outside of those. Our planes are grounded. We have a hard border at Northern Ireland.
Our planes are not grounded, sir. No, that is just nonsense. It's a fallacy to believe that, and I will come on to that in a moment. I promise you, that is not true. And there are plenty of countries that negotiate separate arrangements around Erasmus and so forth that are not part of the EU. Now, the new opportunities for us in that no-deal scenario, I need to touch on this because it's an extremely important part of the equation. So as we move out from under restrictions imposed by the EU, we have very real opportunities, significant opportunities. President Trump made it very clear at Davos that Britain will go to the front of the line and not at the back of the line. It was so much more compelling when he said line than when Barack Obama used the non-American word queue. And it's not just because of the so-called special relationship. The US knows it will be much easier to negotiate with one country than 27. According even to Brussels, the prospect of a revived EU-US deal is currently in the deep freeze. What about financial services? So that's my industry and such a big part of the economy today, and so much noise made about that. Well, here again, you need to distinguish between what business leaders will say to make a point about something that they want and what they actually need. So for a start, the whole cliff edge panic attack, the whole thing about the planes and so forth, needs to be taken with a complete grain of salt. It is a fallacy. Continuity of contracts and continuing operations is protected under both EU and international law. And if you believe otherwise, sir, you are really accusing the EU of capriciousness if we imply that they would be so whimsical as to not apply the law. In fact, in the city, to be honest, it's really quite business as usual these days. We're looking after our customers, and we continue to innovate, because that will be our strong suit in the future. At my firm, Legal & General, Brexit is regarded as just one of many issues around us. Look at the volatile stock markets in the world this week. That is all to do with worries about rate rises, not geopolitics. Behind closed doors, across the city generally, people are focused on the Let's Grow challenge. We're thinking, how can we create more business? We're not thinking of Brexit as a damage limitation exercise. I'm running out of time, so can I carry on? Sorry. So we're making plans. We're not sitting around hoping or moping. The fund management industry has created an international trade and investment group. I'm part of that group. It would be great to have a good deal, but if not, we already have a massive outreach program underway, visits to China, India, Latin America, Switzerland, the US, Canada, Australia, and other countries. It's not just a promotional exercise either. Fund management companies and our customers have benefited from a good cross-border EU framework for funds. It's a bit technical, it's known as UCITS, but in the event we can't be part of that, we are working on an even better version. We're doubling it UKITS or BRICSITS, depending on who you talk to. The talent, the ecosystem, and the assets all lie here. So please, we have to think bigger here. We have to have a bit of self-belief. Our priority together must be to develop a vision for Britain, a plan for long-term growth, a plan for prosperity for more people in this country, in a world of many upheavals, not just Brexit. We are not supplicants. We do not need to beg for crumbs from the EU table. We do not need to accept a bad deal. We are, as has been said, the 5th largest economy in the world. We can take our place alongside the 167 other non-EU countries in the world. The European Commission itself says that 90% of global economic growth over the next 10 years will come from outside Europe. I said at the beginning, in life generally, if we don't think we can achieve something, we certainly can't. But if we have a vision, self-belief, and a thoughtful, evolving plan, in my experience, both in business and on social issues, we are very likely to succeed. I will suggest that you must never let the fear of what might go wrong prevent you from going for greatness. Ladies and gentlemen, by voting against the motion, you would be consigning this great country to a bad deal, a deal that would inevitably not be in Britain's best interests, a sellout that would leave us with the worst of all worlds. If you believe that we, and by which I really mean you as our future generation, have a lot to offer on the global stage, then you should logically vote in favour of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. We now move to our closing speaker of the evening. The fourth opposition speaker is Lord Karen Bilimoria, the founder, former CEO and chairman of Cobra Beer. Lord Bilimoria is an independent crossbench life peer and an ex-vice president of the Cambridge Union. Lord Bilimoria.
2 years ago, this month, the referendum was called. 2 years ago, if you asked the British people, what are your important issues, the European Union would have been way down the list. It was not an issue. It has been made an issue that has now divided our country and divided our parliament. Jacob started off by emphasizing the 17.4 million people, the taking back control of our laws, of our borders, and of our money, and his worry about being a vassal state, and then he spoke about these things called Vanuks. Anyway, we'll skip that. Helena spoke of vision and a framework, and she spoke passionately about Britain being number one in the world in so many things. Isn't it marvelous that we've achieved that in spite of being in the European Union for 44 years? The result of the referendum was a very narrow result. David Cameron called it. We can debate what a bad decision it was to have a referendum. Lord Adonis says they're bad things. We've had very few of them in our history. And this is the first time, by the way, referendums happened where the will of Parliament has not been the same as the will of the people in that result. Do you know that over 2/3 of the House of Commons were Remainers before the referendum? Well over 75% of my colleagues were Remainers. And yet, now, suddenly, the parliamentarians are like lemmings. They have to respect the will of the people. Well, just remember why this referendum was called. It was called because of one part of one party and another party called UKIP. And what is all this about respecting regulations if there's a transition period? Of course we're going to have to respect the regulations. Of course we're going to have to pay in. Of course we're going to have to allow movement of people. And the scenarios that were this new leaked report, whatever deal, no deal, bad deal, soft Brexit, we are going to be worse off, and more so because of leaving the single market. In the way that 3 million people from the European Union, who we should be grateful for, without them there would be a labor shortage in this country. We should be grateful to them, and again they're being used as bargaining chips, and that makes me ashamed as a citizen of this country. And I'm a Eurosceptic, I declare. I hate the European Parliament. I don't know who my MEPs are. I don't know if anyone does. I'm so sorry. Thank God we didn't join the euro. What a mistake the euro has been. And we're not part of Schengen, so from a security point of view, that's better. We will never have a United States of Europe. We signed out of that totally. And we've had these talks about ever closer union Gerard spoke about. Well, for a start, the Visegrad countries, Poland and Hungary, are not going to allow ever closer union. And the EU has so many faults, but on balance, however much a Eurosceptic I might be, we've done well out of being in the European Union. We've had the highest cumulative GDP growth of any country, not Germany, us, 62%. And now look at the forecasts, the worst OBR forecasts. For 5 years, we're going to be growing at less than 2% is what they forecast. And then Gerard talks about the trend of EU trade going down as a proportion of our trade. Yes, it may be going down. There are countries like India that are growing, China that's growing, but whatever way you look at it, it's approximately 50% of our trade. And then through the EU, we have free trade agreements with over 20 countries, including now Japan and Canada. So you add the 50 and the 20, that's 70%. And then you've got 30% that we don't have free trade deals with. Are you asking me as a businessman to give up that 70% and go after the 30% and then I'm being global? We're already very global. And by the way, the Commonwealth, I'd love to do more trade with the Commonwealth. The total percentage of our trade with the Commonwealth, including India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and all the 50 countries in the Commonwealth, is less than 10% of our trade. Canada does an EU free trade agreement. It's with trade only. It's nowhere near as good as what we've got at the moment. What percentage is the EU of Canada's trade? Less than 10%. Who is Canada's biggest trading partner? The United States of America. The £8 billion that we pay to the EU, this money, take back our money, 1% of our annual government expenditure of £800 billion a year. I would pay that for the peace that we've had in Europe, thanks to the European Union and NATO. And then, all this talk about taking back control of our laws, let's be realistic. I've been in Parliament for 11 and a half years. Yes, there are EU regulations, but the laws that affect us on our day-to-day basis, be it taxes, be it planning laws, be it education, they are made by our Parliament in the UK. That's what makes, there's no taking back control in that sense. And now UKIP. 12.5% of the vote in the referendum was UKIP, just less than 2 years ago. Do you know what it is today? 1.8%. Let's not even talk about their leader. So let's now look at a situation where everyone talks about after Brexit, when we've left the European Union. The point I want to make is, as Steve Jobs said, changing your mind is a sign of intelligence. Keynes said, if the facts change, I change my mind, don't you, sir? And even David Davis said, if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy. Juncker and Barnier are saying, stay on, we would welcome you staying on. Farage has spoken about a second referendum. Boris Johnson has said that there's now danger that Brexit will not take place. And by the way, Article 50, I believe, and one of my peers who wrote it, Lord Kerr, is unilaterally revocable by us. That's never been tested before, but it is, and it can, but the reality is the European Union want us to stay on. Now, if we go back now to the directives, here's a European Union regulation that no one has ever spoken about. We don't have control of our borders. There's a 2004 directive that allows any EU country, who allows in free movement nationals, to repatriate them after 3 months if they show that they cannot support themselves. Do you know we've never used that rule? Countries like Belgium have used it and actually returned thousands of people. And then we say we don't have control of our borders. The complexity, one of my colleagues, a former head of the civil service, was called in by David Davis and said, how long will it take to implement the changes of Brexit within the civil service across all the government departments? And he said, Secretary of State, if you want me to be optimistic, 10 years. Realistically, 15 years. Last week I was talking to the EU Prime Minister, and he assured me, he said, all 27 of us want you to stay. We value Britain as an open economy. We value Britain at that table as the second biggest economy in Europe. Please, please stay. Every waking hour, people are waking up. Business uncertainty that's been spoken about. This is not a burning platform that we entered in. As a business, you make drastic change if you're on a burning platform. Nikki spoke about our standing in the world. We were flying before this referendum. We had the highest GDP growth rate in the Western world. Now the EU is growing faster than we are. Now we're the lowest growth rate in the G7. Now the world economy is growing much more than we are. And countries like India, do you know India has free trade deals with only 9 countries in the world? They'd love to do a free trade deal with the UK. Point number one, their priority, and I've heard this from the horse's mouth, is the EU-India free trade agreement. And point number two is that it also involves movement of people as well. So I want to conclude with the whole sense of Britain's democracy, fair play, justice. I'm so proud of this country. The whole world respects this country. And yet, experts in this country are useless. Judges have been called the enemies of the people. Our judiciary, the most respected in the world. And now Treasury forecasts are doubted. Our civil servants are doubted. 3 former cabinet secretaries, colleagues of mine on the crossbenches, Lord Butler, Lord Turnbull, Lord O'Donnell. One of them, Lord Butler, served Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and Tony Blair. These are non-party political individuals. They have been criticized. They have been upset. This is not where this country should be going to. People who do not support Brexit and support the will of the people are called traitors. We're not patriotic. The MPs who vote against it are called mutineers because of the will of the people. Well, 2 years later, 90% of business want to remain. And here's the main point. The 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds 2 years ago did not get a vote. This is not a battle of Britain. This is a battle for the future of Britain. for your future. And as Professor Deepak Malhotra at the Harvard Business School, who I consulted, a world expert in negotiations, he said, Karan, read a book about the build-up of the First World War. Reading that book, it was like watching a train crash in slow motion. He said that is Brexit. It is watching a train crash in slow motion. So no deal is the worst possible situation. A bad deal is bad, but a no deal is by far the worst. And as Lord Adonis said, actually, the best thing for our country is to remain in the European Union. We have that option now. We still have that option to remain, and as a democratic country, the eyes of history are on us right now, and history will be written by all of you. So Cambridge has always led the way in history. Let us lead the way again and condemn Brexit to the dustbin of history where it belongs. And, if I may, I conclude, believe this. We have got to believe in this, because as Mahatma Gandhi said, our beliefs become our thoughts become our words become our actions become our habits form our character, and our character will determine our destiny to remain in the European Union.
Thank you very much, Lord Villamoria. If everyone could remain in their seats briefly, I just need to explain a few things. Firstly, the way that voting works, as always has, is that you walk through the door which you agree with. The ayes is on that side on both floors, the noes is on the left side on both floors, and abstention through the middle. Please, can you right now remember that actually, I forgot to say it, we're voting online today. For anyone who's watching through the live stream, for the first time, you're able to vote as well. So please visit the website that should be currently on screen. And yes, if you wouldn't mind remaining seated whilst we let the front 2 rows go into the dining room, if we can all thank them as well. It's been a fantastic debate. Thank you very much, Steve.